Rough ride to redemption. Welcome to the world of Western romance. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The wind was a relentless thief, a constant, mournful presence across the high plains that stole the warmth from his bones and kicked up dust that stung her eyes and coated the back of her throat, a persistent reminder of how empty everything had become since her father was gone. Every powerful gust that rattled the weathered timbers of the small ranch house seemed to whisper his name, a ghostly echo in the vast, unforgiving landscape that she now faced entirely on her own, a world where survival was a daily, grinding battle. The fences, which her father had always maintained with a dedicated, almost religious fervor, keeping them taut and true against the pressures of both livestock and the elements, now sagged in weary surrender in several places, their posts loosened by the relentless cycle of a harsh winter's freeze and a spring's muddy thaw. The creek, the very lifeblood of their arid property, had dwindled to a pathetic, muddy trickle, a brown and sluggish scar on the parched earth, forcing her to undertake the back-breaking task of hauling bucket after heavy bucket of water from the deep well, a chore that left her muscles screaming in protest and her spirit frayed to the point of breaking. It had been 3 agonizing months since they had found her father at the bottom of Miller's Canyon, his body broken and lifeless, his loyal horse standing a solemn vigil beside him in the long shadows of the rock walls. The sheriff, a man whose hurried investigation seemed to lack any real curiosity, had quickly declared it a tragic accident, a simple misstep on a notoriously treacherous trail. But that facile explanation had never settled right in his gut, feeling too easy, too convenient, especially with the imposing shadow of Blackwood looming ever larger over her daily existence. Blackwood, a man whose immense wealth was as vast and intimidating as the territory he ruthlessly controlled, had been circling her small, defiant ranch like a patient vulture long before her father's untimely death. He owned all the surrounding lands, a sprawling and ever-expanding empire of cattle and political influence, and her family's modest homestead was a stubborn, irritating thorn in his side, a disruption to his absolute dominion and a challenge to his authority. His visits to the ranch had become more frequent and cloying since the funeral, his deep voice dripping with a syrupy, feigned sympathy that made skin crawl with a visceral revulsion. He would make himself comfortable on her porch, his large, imposing frame overwhelming her father's handcrafted chair, and speak at length about the immense burdens now resting on such a young woman's shoulders, pontificating on the myriad dangers of a woman living alone in such a wild place, his words weaving a suffocating net of concern that felt far more like a cage. Each subsequent offer to buy her out, always presented as a gesture of simple, neighborly kindness, was heavily laced with an unspoken, chilling threat, a predatory glint in his dark eyes that promised she could not possibly hope to hold out forever against his resources and his will. He coveted her land, but more than that, he desperately wanted her water rights, the very heart of her property and the key to his own expansion, and Blackwood was a man thoroughly accustomed to getting what he wanted, one way or another. Would stand her ground during these encounters, her petite frame held rigid with a defiance she had inherited directly from her father, her sharp hazel eyes meeting his without flinching, even as her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She was her father's daughter, through and through, and this land was soaked in his sweat, his blood, and his dreams. She would not, could not, let it be stolen away by a serpent disguised in a rich man's fine leather boots. The storm arrived without the courtesy of a warning, a bruised and violent stain spreading rapidly across the pale canvas of the afternoon sky, consuming the light with an ominous speed. The air grew unnaturally heavy and still, charged with a palpable electric tension that made the hairs on her arms stand on end, before the heavens finally tore open with a deafening roar. Rain fell not in individual drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, a torrential deluge that turned the dusty, cracked yard into a churning, turbulent sea of red mud. It was a downpour of biblical proportions, a roaring curtain that blurred the line between earth and sky, erasing the familiar horizon and completely isolating the small, vulnerable ranch in the heart of the maelstrom. had just managed to herd the last of her nervous, wide-eyed horses into the relative safety and dry comfort of the barn when she saw it through the blinding sheets of rain, a dark, struggling shape staggering through the downpour, a spectral figure emerging from the chaos of the storm. It was a horse, its head hanging low in utter exhaustion, its gait a painful, stumbling rhythm of pure desperation. Slumped over its saddle, clinging precariously to the horn as if by sheer will alone, was the limp body of a man. The horse, guided by some final, desperate instinct for shelter, finally collapsed in a heap near the large barn doors, sending its unconscious rider tumbling unceremoniously into the thick, clinging muck. For a long, heart-stopping moment, froze in place, her mind racing through every cautionary tale her father had ever told her about the inherent dangers of the trail and the dark desperation that could drive strange men to do terrible things. But the raw, elemental pity of the scene before her, the utterly exhausted animal, the motionless man at the mercy of the storm, ultimately overrode her ingrained fear. She was alone and she was vulnerable, but she was not heartless. Gathering every last ounce of her surprising strength, she half-dragged, half-carried the heavy, inert form of the man out of the torrential rain and into the dry, hay-scented air of the barn. He was a dead weight of solid muscle and bone, and his rough clothes were soaked completely through, sticking to his body like a miserable second skin. He was blond, his hair matted with a disgusting mixture of mud and what was clearly blood, and a thick, unkempt beard and mustache obscured much of his face, making him impossible to identify. He was deeply unconscious, his breathing dangerously shallow and ragged, and a feverish heat radiated from his skin, a clear sign of a raging infection. It was only when she carefully pulled his sodden shirt away from his torso to check for injuries that she found the terrifying source of his condition. A dark, ugly gunshot wound, low on his side, the flesh around it puckered, swollen, and an angry, inflamed red. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over her, but she pushed it down with a grim, practiced resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Panic was a dangerous luxury she simply couldn't afford. Rushing back to the house through the driving, relentless rain, she gathered what she thought she would need. A full bottle of her father's strongest whiskey, the sharpest knife from the kitchen block, clean bandages hastily torn from old, and the small, familiar metal tin containing her mother's sewing needles and thread. Returning to the barn's dim interior, she fortified herself with a raw, burning swallow of whiskey that seared a fiery path down her throat, then set to work by the flickering, dancing light of a single lantern. With the grim determination of a battlefield surgeon, she heated the tip of her knife in the lantern's hot flame until it glowed orange, gritted her teeth against the unpleasant task ahead, and began to probe the wound. The man groaned in the depths of his unconsciousness, a low, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated agony that tore at her conscience, but he did not wake. After what felt like an eternity of careful, nauseating work, her knife finally found the misshapen, flattened lump of lead. She drew it out with a sickening squelch and a fresh rush of dark blood, her hands shaking from the effort but her purpose unwavering. She cleaned the wound as best she could, pouring the harsh whiskey directly into it and watching the man's body arch in silent torment, before she stitched the ragged flesh closed with clumsy but effective sutures and packed it with a poultice of yarrow and other herbs her father had taught her to use for deep wounds. As she worked over him, a strange and unexpected connection formed between them, a silent sense of shared humanity in the face of the violent, indifferent world that roared and raged just outside the barn doors. He woke 2 days later, the fever having finally broken, the storm having long since passed, leaving the world outside washed clean, glistening, and deceptively peaceful. Was inside the barn, methodically mucking out a stall, when she heard a distinct rustle from the large pile of clean hay where she had made his bed. She turned sharply, her hand instinctively moving toward the handle of the nearby pitchfork, her entire body tensing in anticipation of a threat. His eyes were open, and they were the first thing she truly noticed about him, the first feature to emerge from the anonymous, bearded stranger. They were a deep, weary brown, the color of wet earth, and they were filled with a profound caution that bordered on outright suspicion, the eyes of a man who expected betrayal from the world. He tried to push himself into a sitting position, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips as the sudden movement pulled violently at his fresh stitches. "Easy," she said, her voice softer and more gentle than she had intended it to be. "You've been shot. You need to lie still and rest." He didn't answer her, his intense gaze sweeping methodically around the barn, taking in every detail with a practiced, analytical eye. The worn tools hanging neatly on the walls, the sturdy overhead beams, the single, large exit, before finally settling back on her face. He was a man wrapped in a thick shroud of silence, a fortress of his own making, offering no name, no explanation, and no story to fill the vast, unnerving void of his presence. He accepted the bowl of thin broth and the ladle of water she offered without a single word of thanks, his watchful eyes following her every move as she went about her familiar chores, his silence more unnerving than any questions might have been. In the days that followed, as his physical strength slowly but surely returned, he became a quiet, constant observer of her daily struggle. From his bed in the hay, he watched her mend the sagging fence with scavenged wire and sheer grit, saw the immense strain in her back and shoulders as she hauled the heavy, sloshing buckets of water from the deep well, and he noticed the weary, bone-deep slump of her shoulders at the end of each long, exhausting day. His sharp gaze would often drift to the distant property line, a flicker of something unreadable and hard in his eyes as he spotted the distant, silhouetted figures of Blackwood's riders making their daily, intrusive patrol, a constant, circling reminder of the threat she faced. One afternoon, a posse of armed men thundered past on the main track, led by Sheriff Miller, a man whose unwavering loyalty to Blackwood was an open and often discussed secret throughout the county. The sheriff slowed his horse to a walk as he passed her ranch, his cold eyes lingering on the property for a long moment before he called out to her, his voice deceptively casual, asking if she'd seen a wanted man, a fugitive accused of a stagecoach robbery a few counties to the east. Her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs, shook her head, her face a carefully constructed mask of ignorant innocence she did not feel. She was acutely, terrifyingly aware of the man lying in her barn, a stranger with a gunshot wound and no name, and the disparate pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in her mind in a way that truly terrified her. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, she confronted him. Standing a safe distance from his hay bed, a space she consciously maintained for her own safety, she laid out her terms, her voice impressively steady despite the tremor she could feel deep in her hands. "I don't know who you are or what you've done," she began, her words clear and direct, "and right now I don't particularly care to know. But the sheriff is actively looking for someone and you're hurt and you're hiding. I'll keep my mouth shut. I won't turn you in. But you can't just lie here forever and expect me to take care of you. In return for my silence and this barn over your head, you work. You help me save this place from falling apart." He looked at her for a long, unblinking moment, his deep brown eyes searching her face as if trying to read her very soul. And then, after a silence that stretched her nerves to their breaking point, he gave a single, decisive nod. The desperate, unspoken bargain was struck. An awkward and tense period of adjustment settled over the ranch, a fragile, unspoken truce between two wary and damaged strangers who had been bound together by the whims of fate and violence. Still half believing he was just a common outlaw, a dangerous drifter whose life skills were likely limited to a fast horse and a quicker gun, took it upon herself to instruct him on the fundamental basics of ranch work, a task she approached with a great deal of trepidation. She was fully prepared for incompetence, for sullen laziness, for the resentful, passive resistance of a man who was clearly unused to honest, back-breaking labor. What she found, to her constant surprise, was something else entirely. She would begin to show him how to properly tension a length of barbed wire, only to find him finishing the entire section of fence with an astonishing efficiency, an innate skill that far surpassed her own hard-won experience. She watched, completely baffled, as he calmed her most nervous and flighty mare, a horse that shied from everyone, with just a low, soothing murmur and a steady, confident hand, accomplishing something that even her father had often struggled to do. He seemed to possess an almost preternatural understanding of the land and its subtle, complex rhythms, accurately predicting a sudden shift in the weather by the agitated behavior of the birds, and even finding a new, hidden spring bubbling up in a rocky draw that her father, who had known this land intimately, had missed for years. The dynamic between them became a curious, silent dance of her surprise and his quiet competence, a constant of her assumptions. The pinnacle of this strange new partnership came one sweltering, dusty afternoon when a particularly stubborn and agile calf, slick with sweat and wiry as a whip, found a small, weak spot in a corral and made a bold break for freedom. What followed was a chaotic, scrambling chase through thorny scrub brush and sucking mud. Flustered and shouting useless commands, was repeatedly and embarrassingly outsmarted by the wily, fleet-footed animal. The man she had started calling him Joe in her mind, for the simple lack of a real name, moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, anticipating the calf's frantic moves, cutting off its escape routes with an economy of motion that was beautiful to watch. In the end, they cornered the exhausted animal together in a shallow, muddy wallow, a frantic wrestling match that left them both slipping and sliding, coated from head to toe in thick, sticky, red mud. When the calf was finally subdued and securely returned to its pen, they stood panting in the yard, looking at each other's ridiculous, mud-caked state, and a slow, tired grin spread across Joe's face. It was the very first time she had seen him smile, and it completely transformed his weary, bearded features, revealing a hint of the man beneath the fugitive's mask. A laugh, rusty and unused, escaped from his chest, and caught completely off guard by the rich, warm sound, found herself laughing too, a deep, genuine, soul-cleansing laugh that echoed across the quiet, lonely yard. In that single, shared moment of levity, covered in mud and shared exhaustion, the thick wall of suspicion and fear between them cracked, just for a moment, revealing the tantalizing possibility of something more than just a grim alliance for survival. The fragile, budding peace was shattered a week later. The sheriff returned, his horse kicking up a plume of arrogant dust as it trotted into her yard. This time, he was alone, which was somehow far more menacing and sinister than if he had brought his posse. He dismounted with a practiced ease, his considerable bulk blocking the warm afternoon sun, his thumbs hooked casually into his gun belt in a gesture of relaxed authority. He didn't bother with the usual pleasantries. His questions were pointed, sharp, and invasive, circling relentlessly around the topic of her new, mysterious ranch hand. Where had he come from? What was his name? Why was he here? His tone was laden with a heavy, deliberate intimidation, and his cold, hard eyes swept over her body in a way that made her feel small, exposed, and utterly vulnerable. "It's a dangerous world for a young lady out here on her own," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl that sent a shiver down her spine. "A powerful man like Blackwood can offer a great deal of protection. You'd be wise to accept it, and you'd be even wiser to be more careful about the company you choose to keep." He lingered for a moment, letting his thinly veiled threat hang heavy and poisonous in the air between them, before mounting his horse with a grunt and riding away, leaving a trail of unsettled dust and palpable fear in his wake. From the deep, concealing shadows of the barn, Joe had watched the entire, tense exchange, his body held rigid with a cold fury, his right hand resting on the smooth, worn grip of the Colt pistol he now kept constantly hidden in his bedroll. The sheriff's pointed visit had irrevocably changed the equation. He was no longer just a hunted fugitive finding a temporary, desperate shelter. He was now a magnet for the very danger he had sought to escape, drawing it directly to her doorstep. By staying, he hadn't just saved himself from the wilderness. He had placed this fiercely independent, courageous young woman directly in the crosshairs of the ruthless men he was running from. He was no longer just a burden on her resources. He was a grave liability, a threat to her very life. The fugitive and the farmer were now bound inextricably together, trapped as unwilling partners in the opening moves of a much more dangerous and deadly game than either of them could have possibly imagined. The weeks following the sheriff's unsettling visit settled into a new and surprisingly productive rhythm, a period of intense, shared labor that began to slowly, but surely transform the desperate atmosphere of the ranch. Joe's presence was a quiet but powerful catalyst, his relentless work ethic a stark contrast to the weary resignation that had begun to seep into the very soil of the property. He rose with the first pale hints of dawn, long before the sun had crested the distant mesas, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood, or the steady ring of his hammer against metal, often the first sounds to greet as she emerged from the house into the cool morning air. His efforts were not those of a man merely paying a debt, but of someone who understood intrinsically what was required to make the land yield, his hands moving with a practiced and confident familiarity that spoke of a life lived in close communion with hard work and tangible results. The sagging fences that had so demoralized now stood taut and strong, their newly replaced posts forming a defiant line against the sprawling wilderness and the avaricious gaze of their neighbor. The once sluggish creek, cleared of debris and its banks reinforced, now ran with a healthier, more vigorous flow, and a small but effective irrigation ditch he engineered began to breathe new life into her father's neglected vegetable garden. The overt harassment from Blackwood's men, the brazen rides close to her property line, and the deliberately intimidating presence ceased almost entirely, replaced by a more subtle but no less menacing form of surveillance. Their distant, silhouetted figures now watching from their very stillness a testament to the new, unknown variable that Joe represented. This shift from active aggression to watchful waiting did little to calm's nerves, but it did provide a crucial, desperately needed space for her and Joe to work, to build, and to fall into a routine that was as comfortable as it was unspoken. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, a well-oiled machine of shared purpose, the long hours filled not with conversation, but with the easy, intuitive understanding of two people moving in perfect concert. The silence that had once been a thick, unnerving barrier of suspicion and fear between them slowly began to thin, evolving into a form of deep, quiet companionship, a shared space where words were often unnecessary because the labor itself, the mutual effort poured into the land, said everything that needed to be said. As the physical barriers on the ranch were mended, the emotional ones between its two solitary inhabitants began to slowly crumble, giving way to a tentative, fragile trust that bloomed in the quiet moments after the work was done. During the long, warm evenings, sitting on the porch as the stars began to prick the vast, darkening velvet of the sky, they started to share small, carefully chosen fragments of their lives. Found herself speaking of her father, her voice soft with a mixture of grief and fierce pride, as she recounted his unwavering dream of building something permanent and meaningful from this harsh, unforgiving land, a legacy for the future. She spoke of his calloused hands, his deep, rumbling laugh, and the unwavering belief he had held in the goodness of the earth, a faith she was now fighting with every fiber of her being to uphold against the encroaching darkness of Blackwood's ambition. Joe, in turn, listened with an unnerving, focused intensity, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon as if seeing echoes of his own past in her words. He never spoke of specific places or people, his history remaining a closely guarded, locked room, but he began to talk in more abstract terms about a life he once knew, a world governed by a strict and unwavering code of honor, a place where a man's word was his bond and justice was not a concept to be bought and sold. There was a profound, aching nostalgia in his voice during these conversations, a deep well of bitterness for a world he clearly felt had been lost or betrayed, and began to understand that the weary sadness in his eyes was not just that of a man on the run, but of a man mourning the death of his own deeply held principles. One evening, his gaze fell upon her father's old rocking chair, a dilapidated and broken thing that sat forlornly in a corner of the porch, one of its rockers splintered and its seat cracked and weathered. The next day, and for several days after, during the rare moments of rest he allowed himself, he began to work on it. With a surgeon's meticulous care, he mended the splintered rocker, carefully sanding and shaping a new piece of wood until it was a perfect match. He reinforced the joints, replaced the cracked seat with new, carefully woven leather strips, and patiently sanded down the entire frame before rubbing it with oil until the wood glowed with a renewed, lustrous warmth. Watched him from a distance, her heart clenching with an emotion she couldn't quite name. When he was finally finished, he didn't make a grand presentation or announce his accomplishment. He simply moved the restored chair back to its rightful place on the porch, a silent, humble offering. That evening, as she tentatively sat in it, feeling the smooth, sturdy wood beneath her and the gentle, comforting rhythm of its rock, she looked over at him, and the unspoken, overwhelming gratitude that shone in her eyes was more eloquent and powerful than any words could ever have been. The fragile peace, however, was merely the calm before a new and more vicious storm. The attack, when it came, was not a direct confrontation, but a calculated, crippling blow aimed at the very heart of their struggle for survival. One morning, as dawn broke in a blaze of orange and pink across the plains, they discovered the devastation. A long section of their newly mended northern fence had been deliberately and methodically cut, the wires snipped with a cold, brutal precision. Through the gaping hole, the tracks in the damp earth told a clear and sickening story. A dozen of their best cattle, the core of their small herd and their primary hope for any future income, had been driven off into the Badlands, swallowed by the vast, lawless territory that served as Blackwood's shadow kingdom. The financial blow was catastrophic, a crippling setback that threatened to undo all of their recent, hard-won progress and push the ranch to the absolute brink of failure. Stared at the cut wires, her face a pale, frozen mask of disbelief that slowly hardened into something far more dangerous. The despair was there, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was quickly consumed by a rising tide of cold, unyielding fury. This was no longer just about business or land. It was a deeply personal violation, a cruel and deliberate attempt to break her spirit. Seeing the fire of hardened resolve replace the tears of grief in her eyes, Joe's quiet, protective demeanor underwent a stark and terrifying transformation. The weariness in his expression vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal anger that made his brown eyes seem as hard and unforgiving as chips of flint. This was the final provocation, the line that could not be uncrossed. "This is my fault," he said, his voice a low, gravelly growl that held a new and dangerous edge. He finally turned to face her, his expression grim, the time for secrets and evasions having been violently stripped away. "I'm not who you think I am. My name is Joe, and I'm not a stagecoach robber." He took a deep breath, the confession spilling out of him in a torrent of raw, bitter truth. "I was a Texas Ranger. I was working undercover, investigating a vast criminal syndicate that dealt in rustling, extortion, and murder, a network run by a man who had judges and in his pocket. A man named Blackwood. My superior officer, a man I trusted with my life, was on Blackwood's payroll. He set me up, framed me for a crime I didn't commit, and left me for dead. That gunshot wound wasn't from a posse. It was from the man who betrayed me." He paused, his gaze boring into hers, demanding that she understand the full weight of his revelation. "I'm not just a fugitive hiding from the law," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, charged with a deadly intensity. "I'm a hunter, and I came to this territory on the trail of the man who runs it all." The revelation hung in the air between them, as stark and shocking as the severed wires of the fence. Everything suddenly snapped into a terrifyingly clear focus. The sheriff's pointed interest, Blackwood's relentless pressure, the very fact that Joe had ended up on her property in the first place. He wasn't running from the law. He was the law, or at least he had been, before it had been twisted into a weapon against him. This knowledge changed everything, reframing their entire situation from a simple matter of survival against a greedy neighbor to a desperate, two-person war against a powerful, entrenched criminal conspiracy. That evening, the usual comfortable silence of the porch was replaced by a heavy, charged atmosphere of unspoken questions and impossible choices. Joe finally broke the tension, his voice low but unwavering, filled with a conviction that left no room for argument. "Running is no longer an option," he stated, his gaze fixed on the distant, mocking lights of Blackwood's massive estate. "He knows I'm here now, or at least he suspects. He won't stop until he has this land, and he won't stop until he's certain I'm buried under it. This isn't just about my name anymore. He's made it about your home, your father, your future. The only way we can survive this, the only way to save this ranch, is to stop running and to start fighting back. We have to expose Blackwood for the murdering thief that he is." He was no longer just hiding out in her barn. He was declaring his intention to stand his ground, to turn her small, isolated ranch into the front line of his personal war. The sheer, terrifying audacity of his proposal, the overwhelming odds stacked against them, should have sent a wave of paralyzing fear through. Instead, she felt a strange, exhilarating surge of defiant hope. For the first time since her father's death, she was not entirely alone in her fight. Later that night, long after the last embers of the fire had died and the moon had risen high in the sky, lay awake in her bed, her mind a chaotic whirlwind of fear, anger, and a new, powerful emotion she was afraid to name. The stakes had been raised to a terrifying new level, their lives now irrevocably intertwined in a deadly conflict. She thought of Joe, sleeping in the barn, a man of honor who had been stripped of everything but his own integrity, a man who was now willing to risk what little he had left to fight for her. An overwhelming, irresistible force pulled her from her bed. Barefoot and clad only in her simple cotton nightdress, she slipped out of the house and crossed the moonlit yard, the cool, damp earth a shock against her skin. The large barn doors were slightly ajar, and she pushed them open, the hinges groaning softly in the profound silence. Joe was not asleep. He was sitting on the edge of his hay bale bed, the moonlight slanting through the high window and illuminating the grim, determined set of his jaw. He looked up as she entered, his eyes widening in surprise, and in their depths she saw not the hardened ranger or the weary fugitive, but a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored her own. She walked toward him, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that seemed to shake her entire body. No words were spoken. None were needed. When she reached him, she simply stopped, and he rose to meet her, the small space between them crackling with an almost unbearable tension. Overwhelmed by the raw, tumultuous emotions of the day, by the terror and the hope and the undeniable magnetic pull between them, she reached up, her hands finding their way to his bearded cheeks, and drew his face down to hers. Their first kiss was not a gentle, tentative exploration, but a desperate, passionate collision, a raw and hungry expression of all the fear, gratitude, and burgeoning desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. It was a kiss that sealed their dangerous alliance, a silent, fiery vow to face the coming storm together, and in its searing heat, a new and powerful romance was finally, irrevocably ignited. The raw, desperate passion of their kiss in the moonlit barn did not extinguish the danger surrounding them, but instead tempered it, forging their shared fear and burgeoning love into a sharp, dangerous weapon. A profound and palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere of the small ranch, where the daily rhythm of survival was completely supplanted by the meticulous, high-stakes work of planning an offensive against a man who was, for all intents and purposes, a king in his own territory. Joe, the Texas Ranger, fully emerged from the weary shell of the fugitive ranch hand, and watched, mesmerized, as he transformed the familiar landscape of her home into a strategic map for a two-person war. He began to move with a renewed and formidable purpose, his eyes constantly scanning the distant, his mind dissecting the terrain for tactical advantages and hidden vulnerabilities, and he started to impart his hard-won knowledge to her in a series of intense, whispered lessons under the vast, star-dusted sky. He taught her the subtle, intricate language of the earth, showing her how to distinguish the track of a shod horse carrying a heavy man from one carrying a lighter load, how to read the age of a footprint in the dust by the sharpness of its edges, and how to spot the faint, almost invisible signs of a large herd being driven through dense scrubland. They spent days moving like ghosts through the rugged, unforgiving badlands that bordered her property, a treacherous maze of canyons and arroyos that Blackwood's men used as their private rustling highway. Under Joe's patient and exacting tutelage, learned to move with a silence and stealth she never would have thought possible, her small frame an advantage in the dense undergrowth, and she quickly developed a keen eye for the small, unnatural details that signaled human passage, a broken twig, a scuff mark on a rock, a discarded matchstick. Together, they painstakingly charted the rustlers' secret routes, pinpointing the hidden canyons where stolen cattle were held, and identifying the key rendezvous points where brands were altered and illicit deals were struck, their shared notebook filling with hand-drawn maps and detailed observations that slowly but surely pieced together the shadow infrastructure of Blackwood's entire criminal enterprise. As their knowledge of Blackwood's operation grew, so did the terrifying realization that simple observation from the outside would never be enough to bring him down. They needed something concrete, something irrefutable, something from within the heart of his fortress. It was during one of their late-night strategy sessions, hunched over a flickering lantern in the barn, that, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and resolve, proposed the most dangerous gambit of all. She would ride into town and approach Blackwood directly, not as an adversary, but as a defeated supplicant, feigning a complete surrender of her will and offering to finally discuss the sale of her ranch. The idea was met with an immediate and vehement refusal from Joe, his protective instincts roaring to life at the mere thought of her willingly placing herself within arm's reach of the man who wanted them both dead. He argued that the risk was too great, that her performance would never be convincing enough, that Blackwood was a predator who would sense the trap instantly. But no longer the frightened girl who had first stumbled upon him in the storm stood her ground with a fiery, unyielding determination. She argued, her voice low and steady, that her very presence, her perceived defeat, was the one thing Blackwood's arrogance would never allow him to question, that her role as the grieving, overwhelmed daughter was the perfect camouflage. She insisted that she was the only one who could get inside his office, the nerve center of his operations, and listen to his conversations, observe his routines, and perhaps, just perhaps, find the single piece of tangible evidence they so desperately needed to expose him. The argument that followed was tense and emotional, a heated clash between his desperate need to protect her and her absolute refusal to remain a passive victim in the fight for her own home. But in the end, her fierce logic and unwavering courage won out, and Joe reluctantly agreed, his face a grim mask of worry that did little to conceal the immense pride he felt for the formidable woman she was becoming. The following morning, put on the dark, dusty green dress she had worn to her father's funeral, a deliberate choice meant to project an image of solemn defeat, and rode into town, every muscle in her body screaming with a tension that was almost unbearable. The town itself, which she had known her entire life, suddenly felt alien and hostile, the familiar faces of its citizens seeming to watch her with a mixture of pity and suspicion as she made her way toward Blackwood's imposing office on the main street. Joe had already positioned himself in a hayloft across the street, a location that gave him a clear but agonizingly distant view of the office window, armed with his pistol and a rifle, a helpless sentinel forced to watch the most precious person in his life walk willingly into the lion's den. Blackwood received her with an air of triumphant, magnanimous grace, his smile a smug, predatory slash across his face that made stomach churn. He ushered her into his opulent office, a room filled with dark, heavy furniture, polished mahogany, and the distinct, cloying smell of expensive cigars and leather. He offered her a seat, pouring them both a drink as he began to speak in a low, condescending tone about her wise and practical decision, his words dripping with a false sympathy that was almost suffocating. Played her part with a skill that surprised even herself, keeping her eyes downcast, her voice soft and hesitant, allowing her hands to tremble slightly as she held her glass, projecting an aura of brokenness and despair. She listened as he spoke nonchalantly on the telephone to his associates, his coded language about shipping manifests and asset consolidation now chillingly clear to her, and she carefully observed the layout of the room, her mind a frantic camera, capturing every detail, every file, every locked drawer, searching for anything that might be out of place, all while feeling Joe's intense, unseen gaze burning into her from across the street. Her opportunity came during her third visit, a week later, a week that had frayed her nerves to the breaking point. She was seated in the same chair, enduring another of Blackwood's patronizing monologues about the future he had planned for her land, when the sheriff burst into the office without knocking, his face flushed with urgency about a problem down at the rail yard that required Blackwood's immediate, personal attention. For the first time, Blackwood seemed genuinely irritated and distracted. He told not to move, that he would be back in a quarter of an hour to finalize their agreement, and swept out of the office with the sheriff, leaving her completely, blessedly alone. The sudden silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the frantic, thunderous beating of her own heart. She flew into action, her movements swift and silent. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for anything she might have missed, and then she saw it, a small, almost imperceptible detail. The corner of the large, ornate rug that lay beneath Blackwood's massive desk was slightly curled, and beneath it, a single floorboard seemed to be sitting just a fraction of an inch higher than its neighbors. With trembling fingers, she knelt and pulled the rug back, her nails scrabbling at the edge of the board until she could pry it up. Her breath caught in her throat. Nestled in the dark, dusty space below was a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was heavy in her hands, heavier than its size would suggest, heavy with the weight of secrets and crimes. Without a second's hesitation, she concealed it within the deep folds of her heavy shawl, replaced the floorboard, smoothed the rug back into place, and was sitting calmly back in her chair, her hands clasped in her lap, just as she heard Blackwood's heavy footsteps returning down the hall. The next 10 minutes were the longest and most agonizing of her life, as she forced herself to listen to his words, to nod at the appropriate times, and to sign a preliminary, meaningless document, all while the cold, hard reality of the ledger pressed against her side, a terrifying and triumphant secret that threatened to scream its existence into the room. That night, back in the relative safety of the barn, the heavy ledger lay on a simple wooden crate between them, its presence dominating the small space. By the flickering, dancing light of a single lantern, Joe carefully opened the cover, and they began to turn the pages, their world shrinking to the columns of stark, spidery script. The book was a meticulous and chillingly dispassionate record of Blackwood's reign of terror, a detailed accounting of every rustled herd, every extorted rancher, every bribe paid to judges, and with Sheriff Miller's name appearing with a sickening regularity. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering, a vast and deeply rooted cancer that had spread its tentacles throughout the entire territory. They were numb with the horror of it all, but they knew they had found the weapon they needed. And then Joe turned to a section near the back, a series of entries from the previous year, and he froze, his face going pale beneath his beard. He pointed a trembling finger at a line of script and leaned closer to read the name written there, her blood turning to ice in her veins. It was her father's name, Jacob. Beside it were a series of dates and notations detailing a horrifying arrangement. Her father, a man she had as the pinnacle of honor and integrity, had discovered Blackwood's rustling operation. Instead of being silenced, he had been blackmailed, forced into a devil's bargain. He had allowed Blackwood's men to move stolen herds across his land during the night, a secret corridor in their vast network, and in exchange, Blackwood had left his ranch, and more importantly, his daughter, untouched. The final entry, dated just 1 week before her father's death, was a single, chilling phrase, becoming a liability. Stared at the words, her mind refusing to process the cataclysmic truth they represented. Her father's death was no accident. The memory of his broken body at the bottom of the canyon, the sheriff's hasty verdict, the pieces all slammed together with the force of a physical blow, revealing a truth so monstrous it threatened to shatter her completely. Grief, betrayal, and a new, cold, terrifying fury washed over her in a suffocating wave, and she let out a single, ragged sob, the sound torn from the very depths of her soul. Joe's arms came around her, a solid, grounding presence in the dizzying, tilting chaos of her world, holding her tight as the devastating reality of her father's final months settled upon them. But their moment of shared grief and cold rage was violently ripped apart by a sudden, unmistakable sound from outside, the distinct, rhythmic thunder of approaching horses, far too many to be a friendly patrol or a lone traveler. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with a shared, dawning horror. Blackwood had discovered the ledger was missing. He hadn't wasted a moment. He had come to reclaim his secrets and to permanently silence the two people who now held the power to destroy him. Shouted commands cut through the night, the voices filled with a brutal, merciless authority, and then the night exploded in a flash of orange light and a deafening crack of rifle fire. The first bullet tore through the thin wall of the ranch house, splintering the wooden door frame with a sound like a gunshot, a violent, unambiguous declaration that their time for planning was over. They were trapped. The siege had begun. The night erupted into a chaotic symphony of violence, a terrifying storm of muzzle flashes, and the sharp, ear-splitting crack of rifle fire that replaced the quiet hum of the crickets. The first volley from Blackwood's men tore through the night, a hailstorm of lead that ripped into the walls of the small ranch house, splintering the aged wood and shattering the single window pane in the main room into 1,000 glittering shards. In that first terrifying second, instinct took over, and Joe tackled, pulling her down to the rough-hewn floorboards just as a second, more concentrated volley ripped through the space where she had been standing. The air grew thick with the acrid, choking smell of gunpowder and the fine dust of pulverized wood, a gritty fog that stung their eyes and coated their throats. The siege was no longer a distant threat. It was a brutal, intimate reality, and their small, beloved home had been transformed into it. Yet in the heart of that chaos, a cold, clarifying calm descended upon Joe. The weary fugitive vanished completely, consumed by the focused, lethal precision of the Texas Ranger. He grabbed the rifle he had leaned against the wall, his movements economical and swift, and pushed a heavy wooden table over to barricade the shattered window, all while issuing a stream of low, urgent commands. He directed to the far side of the room, away from the main door, handing her a spare pistol and a box of cartridges, his eyes locking with hers for a brief, intense moment that conveyed more than words ever could. Trust me, fight with me, survive this. A desperate, furious firefight ignited, a hopelessly lopsided battle that pitted their two rifles against the overwhelming firepower of at least a dozen men. Joe, using his intimate knowledge of the ranch's layout and his deep understanding of tactical combat, turned their vulnerable little house into a surprisingly formidable fortress. He had them moving constantly, firing from different windows, creating the illusion of a larger defending force and preventing Blackwood's men from concentrating their fire on a single point. Her heart, hammering a wild, terrified rhythm against her ribs, discovered a well of cold fury within herself that she never knew existed. The woman who had trembled at the sheriff's intimidation was gone, replaced by a warrior fighting for her home, for the memory of her father, and for the man who had shown her that she was not alone. Her hands, though shaking, became impossibly steady as she reloaded the spare rifle, her movements becoming a swift, practiced rhythm. Eject the spent casing, slide in a new cartridge, slam the bolt home, and pass the weapon back to Joe. She fought with a grim, focused determination, the righteous anger she felt over her father's murder channeling itself into a cold, deadly resolve. They became a seamless unit of survival, a two-person army fueled by desperation and a shared, defiant love, holding back the tide of darkness with every carefully aimed shot, every splinter of wood that flew from the walls serving as a testament to their unbreakable will to live. Outside, Blackwood's voice roared commands, his frustration growing with every minute that his overwhelming force failed to crush the two stubborn souls trapped inside. The brutal, attritional battle stretched on for what felt like an eternity, the barrel of Joe's rifle growing hot in his hands, their precious supply of ammunition dwindling with an alarming speed. The relentless volleys from outside began to take their toll, punching larger and larger holes in the walls, offering less and less protection. Joe knew they were running out of time. Blackwood's men were growing bolder, creeping closer under the cover of the constant suppressing fire, preparing for the final, overwhelming assault that would inevitably breach their crumbling defenses. It was in that moment of deepening despair, as Joe chambered one of his last remaining rounds, that a new and entirely different sound cut through the cacophony of the firefight. It was not the familiar crack of the rifles they had been hearing all night, but something deeper, more powerful, a rhythmic, thundering drumbeat that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was the unmistakable, awe-inspiring sound of a large group of riders approaching at a full, disciplined gallop. For a heart-stopping moment, his face went pale with terror, believing that Blackwood had summoned even more reinforcements to finish the job. But Joe, his head cocked as he listened intently, felt a surge of wild, impossible hope. The cadence was too orderly, too powerful for a ragtag posse of hired thugs. And then, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the night, a command that echoed with the unmistakable ring of official authority, and the gunfire from outside abruptly, blessedly, ceased. Peering cautiously through a splintered hole in the wall, Joe saw a scene that made the breath catch in his throat. A full troop of a dozen Texas Rangers, their silver badges glinting in the moonlight, had silently and efficiently surrounded Blackwood's stunned and disorganized forces, their own rifles held at the ready in a silent, deadly promise. They were led by a tall, graying man with a grim, resolute face, Captain, Joe's old commanding officer, a man whose integrity was as unyielding as the Texas landscape itself. Before the siege had even begun, in a moment of desperate foresight while was in town, Joe had used his last remaining silver dollar to pay a young boy to ride to the nearest telegraph station with a coded message, a desperate, last-ditch plea sent to the one man in the world he still trusted. He had detailed his location, his suspicions about Blackwood, and the evidence he hoped to find, a message that was a prayer sent into the void. That prayer had been answered. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tidal wave of justice. The captured rustlers and hired guns, their faces a mixture of shock and fear, threw down their weapons without a fight. Sheriff Miller, seeing the formidable line of rangers and the cold, unforgiving eyes of Captain fixed upon him, tore the badge from his own chest and threw it to the ground in a pathetic, groveling act of surrender. Blackwood alone remained defiant, his face a mask of apoplectic rage and disbelief, until Joe stepped out of the ruined ranch house, the thick leather ledger held firmly in his hand. He presented it to Captain, and as the ranger began to read the damning entries aloud by the light of a lantern, Blackwood's arrogance finally, irrevocably crumbled. His arrest for a vast criminal conspiracy, and for the cold-blooded murder of Jacob, a quiet and solemn affair that marked the definitive end of his tyrannical reign. In the sudden, profound silence of the aftermath, with the prisoners secured, Joe's name was officially and publicly cleared, the heavy, suffocating weight of the fugitive's life lifting from his shoulders like a physical burden. In the cool, clear light of the dawn that followed, as the last of Blackwood's men were being led away in chains, Captain approached Joe, a moment of profound significance passing between the two men. Held out a gleaming silver star, the iconic badge of a Texas Ranger, polished and new. It was a full reinstatement, an offer to return to the only life Joe had ever known, a life of honor, duty, and purpose. Joe looked at the badge, the powerful symbol of his past, an object for which he had risked everything and which represented the complete restoration of his honor in the eyes of the world. He felt the familiar pull of that life, the call of the open trail and the clear, simple morality of the law. Then, his gaze shifted to who stood on the porch of her battered but still standing home. She was covered in dust and grime, her face smudged with gunpowder and streaked with tears, but her hazel eyes shone with a fierce, unwavering light. She was the embodiment of everything he had fought for, not just through the long, terrifying night, but for weeks. She was his anchor, his partner, his future. With a slow, sad smile, he respectfully shook his head, pushing the captain's hand and the badge gently away. "Thank you, Captain," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went deeper than simple gratitude. "But the man you knew found his redemption right here. I think my trail ends on this piece of land." Looked from Joe's resolute face to the young woman on the porch, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his own weary features, and he simply nodded in understanding before leading his men away, leaving Joe and alone in the quiet dawn of their new beginning. Months later, the scars on the ranch house had been lovingly repaired, the new wood of the walls a paler, brighter testament to the violence it had endured and overcome. The land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, flourishing under the diligent, shared care of its two guardians. The fences were strong, the creek ran clear and full, and the small herd of cattle, now replenished and growing, grazed peacefully in the lush, green pastures. The sun was setting, painting the vast western sky in brilliant, fiery strokes of orange, pink, and deep purple, casting a warm, golden glow across the plains. Joe and sat together on the porch, nestled in the sturdy, familiar comfort of the rocking chair he had so carefully repaired, its gentle, rhythmic creak the only sound in the peaceful evening air. His arm was wrapped securely around her, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder, a perfect and easy fit. The rough, brutal ride was finally over, the ghosts of the past laid to rest, the future stretching out before them, as open and full of promise as the land itself. He tilted her chin up, and she met his gaze, her hazel eyes filled with a deep, abiding love that mirrored the adoration in his own. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that held none of the desperation or frantic survival of their first encounters, but was instead filled with a quiet, profound tenderness, a slow, lingering promise of 1,000 more peaceful sunsets, of a life built not on fighting a shared threat, but on nurturing a shared love. Their redemption had not been found in vengeance or victory, but in each other.